Section 7A, a reply to O.G. Rose, sections 5, 6, and 7. I provide now from Book Theta in Aristotle's Metaphysics, which I believe will illuminate more light on O.G. Rose's account of lack, phenomenology, and free will, which I thought was an excellent cash out of the subjective experience of lack, which is under-threaded through all of O.G. Rose's account of lack in this series of Philosophy of Glimpses. And I rebutted some arguments about it, and in fact some of my accounts here from Aristotle will reinforce my rebuttals to O.G. Rose in sections 1, section 1b, section 1c, 1d, and 1e as well. Okay, so moving on to the actual reply here of 7a. So starting in Theta 1, Aristotle gives an account of substance. In particular, substance can be given an account of potential and actuality. Now, in potential, Demasis, it can be broken into two subcategories. One is synonymous capacities. This is meant to be powers versus non-powers. The example Aristotle uses in Metaphysics in this section is about geometry. So, for example, just one example, that a equilateral triangle must have an internally 180 degrees angle. The equilateral triangle must either have it or not have it. It's a question of being versus non-being. This becomes important later in the discussion of my reply. The other kind of capacity, Demasis, is relation relative to the same kind. He goes on to explain it's a starting point of change, and I think from what we're talking about, we're going to speak about this as a kind of lack. Particularly because he goes on to the state in Theta 1, basically to act and to be acted upon, is the versus unaffected. So, for example, think about something that's flammable versus things that can cause a fire, that can be burned from the fire, and things that are fireproof. So the fire does not affect it, for example. So those are three states. Theta 1 ends with a paragraph from Aristotle discussing rational versus irrational acts, which I think is going to be very interesting later in this discussion. So, for example, when we say something that's irrational that acts, for example, fire, it acts upon oil being flammable, for example. This is made in distinction to what's considered a rational act. For example, the craft of building and acting upon wood, brick, or any other material. Theta 2 picks up on where Theta 1 concluded with this discussion of the capacity of the rational versus the non-rational. And related to specifically O.G. Rose's conversation in section 7 about free will, I've always found this account from Aristotle an incredibly powerful argument for free will, directly tied to rationality. By this account, Aristotle says a rational act is the capacity to do, in this case, act or its contrary, right? Its lack. Versus the non-rational can only do the act itself. So, for example, medicine can either heal or sicken, which is the lack of health. Versus fire can only burn. Fire can't unburn or can't cool, for example. It can only go in one direction. Versus a rational act can go contingently one act or the other. It can be applied to either heal in the case of medicine or sicken the lack. And in fact, Aristotle continues in Theta 2 to point out that the scientific accounts for what's called the present, which is the progama in this case, which means basically the object of scientific knowledge and the lack. Scientific accounts must have both. This is partly why in my rebuttals in section 1 related to the falsifiability of metaphysics, or I argue from lacks, which are metaphysical in nature, that in Aristotle's discussions of what is literally the scientific account is you must have an account of the presence and the lack together, operating together. Now, Aristotle actually, it's very fun. Almost you can see at this foundations of metaphysics, this rush to get to presence instead of lax, because Aristotle continues to point out that, well, yes, you need to give the account of the lack, but it's non-intrinsic to the account, to the science. Instead, science must be focused on what's clear and universal. So this is the progama. I'm using that word, the Greek word, because I think the word present is a little, because technically lax are present too. That's the reason why it's a little awkward to use the word presence when we're speaking in this way. So progama will be used going forward. There is some fairness to this account, because the one thing about lax is that they are of the class, in one way, of the indefinite, which does make sense because actualities are definite. They are present in a very clear way. But capacities are, by some definition, indefinite in nature. So, for example, when I say just versus the non-just has within it two possibilities. It could be the indifferent, or it could be the unjust. So I could see why Aristotle kind of had this instinct to try to be, let's focus on the presence. Let's focus on the progama. But another way to use this example also of how sciences can be applied to presence and lack, I used medicine before, but also with heat. For example, if you're an HVAC person, heating, ventilation, and air conditioning, you have the science, the account to produce heat and cool. Or better said, heat or cool, right? Because you can't do both things at the same time. You would violate the law of non-contradiction otherwise. But you can do condition, basically either or. You can't do both at the same time. Theta 2 continues with an account of virtue and inferences and implications of virtue. So, for example, Aristotle makes the comment that to do X well implies X occurred. An activity, something did X. But to do X does not imply you did X well, for example. So, for example, if you threw the ball well, it does imply you threw the ball. Versus if you threw the ball, it does not imply that, or by necessity include that you threw the ball well. And I think that's actually a very important note in Aristotle that when I always read metaphysics in this section in Theta, I always found this kind of underground account of virtue hiding in the background. Very telling from my point of view. Another account from later in this section, or actually earlier. It's actually in Delta, book Delta. There's a comment that another example where we see again this idea that to do X well is a specific capacity, and in fact, not do something well can even hinder something from having a capacity at all. So, for example, there's an example from Aristotle where he says, one liar can speak, whereas another one cannot speak at all if it does not have a good tone. So the capacity of a liar to play well is said to speak. Basically, it's a metaphorical way of speaking, but the point is that that virtue to do something well extends to non-rational objects, right? That only have a capacity to do one thing, right? Instruments can't choose to do one thing or not well, but they do gain access to things by virtue. I think this idea that granting access to capacities and actualizations of those capacities kind of all points I want us to explore more on in the future. In Delta 12, Aristotle talks about incapacity as a specific lack of a starting point, an arche, and uses an example how, incapacities, it's a ambiguous word because it can mean different things. So, for example, when we talk about a boy, a man, and a eunuch having the incapacity to beget children, to give birth to children, we don't mean this all in the same way for all three of those accounts. Right? A eunuch clearly by necessity cannot beget children, versus a man and a child possibly cannot beget children. The child is an issue of not yet. The child cannot beget children yet because the child is not ready yet. But whereas the man is indefinite, we don't know. It might be a case of drunkenness or infertility. We don't know. So that term for incapacity is more vague or indefinite. This is what I meant before about why I can understand why Aristotle's a little nervous about this investigation of the lack, because lacks have embedded within my kind of ambiguity and polarity of meaning. behind them. This is one example of it. Okay, so with that said, I do want to point out this is mostly a discussion on Aristotle, but there is, I do believe, a very important schism that occurs when we get to Thomas Aquinas on these accounts of lack, mainly because the lack for Aquinas, when we see his discussion of physics, for example, he attaches it to non-being. Whereas I think it's pretty reasonable to say, looking at this section of the Metaphysics from Aristotle, that I think for Aristotle, he is very clearly classifying lacks into the category of being, but in a particular, in the modality of what's possible. So when we look at the modalities, this is from section 5 and kind of built out from, not section 5, delta 5, pardon me, where he talks about necessity. Necessity, its primary definition is the thing when a thing is not to admit of being otherwise, so it must be the case. Pretty obvious point, and there are other secondary effects to it that I think are of interest. I kind of related to my comment before about how for Aristotle, rational acts or is the capacity to do the act or its contrary, its lack. I do see that in part 2 in this delta 5 where Aristotle points out that what's by necessity is forced onto a subject contrary to reason. So you can't, as Aristotle says, you can't negotiate, you can't reason with the force of necessity. And it's a kind of irrational force. It's a one-way train. You can't stop it. Sections 1a and 1b from delta 5 basically point out the thing, without which there could be no existence, or without which there could be no good could come to be, or bad would not exist, would no longer exist. I do think that's important to point out too, because I do understand partly why Aquinas made the decision to discuss privations as non-being, a relation of non-being to being. I understand that, mostly because of the problem of evil. I think is going to have to deal with an account of that, explaining how can evil not be a principle of cause, basically, but instead be a privation of the good. I do think it is possible, but I do think it requires some clear, I think in Aquinas' move to try to solve the problem of evil, he sacrificed really the kind of secrets behind what lacks are pointing to. So from there, we talk about what's there. So I'll talk about what's the impossible versus the possible. Now, what's impossible is the contrary of what's necessary, which is the false, and the false is attached to non-being. That's from delta 5. Delta 7. Delta 7, where truth was discussed as being and falsity attached to non-being. Whereas the possible is potentially true, right? It's not false, which means it's not non-being, but it also could admit of the truth, and it is true. So as you can tell, again, this kind of indefinite state of the possible, because it could be what's possible, it could happen, and then, but it is say that what is possible is clearly not impossible. So it's in a contrary state, or kind of a oppositional state. The way Aristotle talked about it in this section of delta 5. To summarize this reply video, is we've been reviewing from Aristotle's Metaphysics, theta, for the most part, with some delta, book theta. But to summarize the major points, part 1, lacks are related to being as opposed to non-being, which is the major schism between, or understanding when you investigate Thomas Aquinas' account of lacks, or as he called them, privations, versus Aristotle. I think that's actually very significant. It's not a small deviation, it's a huge deviation, because the idea of non-being is attached to what's false, what's impossible. Whereas it seems very reasonable by reading the sections of book theta and delta from Metaphysics that Aristotle would very much feel that lacks are true. They are in the world of the possible, and maybe even of necessity, of necessitas. But at the very minimum, they are definitely not of the domain of the impossible. Something is lacking something by using that word or using those concepts of it. It is pointing to things it's a principle of action and activity that is of the world of the possible, not of the world of the impossible. Because otherwise, it's not a lack. For example, rocks don't lack sight. Never had sight to begin with. This is partly what causes some of the problems with discussions of lack as privation, because privations is and to be fair, Aristotle does have accounts of this. It's the absence of what ought to be, more or less, which could be argued to be a nominalist claim. Basically, it's cultural, it's just a freedom of speech or freedom of culture, as opposed to ontologically real. So there is the idea that lacks are real in the sense that they exist in the world of the possible, which is true or possibly true. It is certainly not the false, put it that way, or of non-being. The next part is that scientific accounts rely on the account of the topragma, which is the present, and the lack of the of the object of the scientific knowledge, and that object of scientific knowledge is a universal. Now that is applied to the toprogma, but clearly I think it's pretty fair to then inference also that the lack is a universal as well, but in this case an absent universal. Now that also attaches not only to the scientific account, but also even from Aristotle's point of view, what makes an act rational at all. The rational act is the act that either does the action or its contrary. Medicine either heals or sickens. The builder can build the building or destroy the building. The technician, the HVAC technician, can either heat a house or cool the house. Can produce the contraries. And all these attached together with an under thread across this entire series of sections on virtue, meaning that to act well. So this attaches to non-rational inanimate objects. So, for example, a lyre can said to speak when it has a good tone, versus another lyre cannot speak at all. This is it's a metaphorical phrasing, but it points out that whole capacities are attached to of inanimate objects are attached to its virtue, having an excellent tone or a good tone. This applies to rational people as well. And in fact, that virtue has its power pre-presumption. So, for example, when we say to do an action well implies that an action was taken, which is not the case. When we say an action was taken implies that it was taken well. If we take this as in the point of virtue or lack of virtue, when we see something as lacking virtue, that in my point of view would argue the same thing. So by lacking, X is not doing something well. It's lacking. It implies that that profession exists. It must. Works. There's a lot more to discuss here, and I think actually I was actually very excited to kind of impose this discussion of virtue. I think it's a very powerful instrument in our discussions about lack, because it's not, as Aristotle points out, it's not just to do something versus not doing something. It's also the question of doing something well, and there are certain powerful, I think, epistemological and ontological implications from a discussion of virtue if we think about it in this way, especially things that lack virtue or are lacking in its virtue. All right, I hope this is very useful for you and a useful conversation. I did hint at Aquinas. I would love to do a further essay on Aquinas, on his accounts of privation. I just hinted at it here. I might do so. So I hope this was useful, and have a great day. Take care.